Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 9 lecture. So again, young X is recommending that they do not take the Spaniards at their word. Of course, he's prescient. He's seeing things as they really are. But even his father, the sort of president guy, also is sort of adopting a cautious approach. They're not exactly buying this notion that the Spaniards are these deities, these superhuman beings who are here to deliver some kind of religious judgment or to perform some kind of good offices. They're not necessarily buying that. So I don't want to get into a whole lot of plot summary. We'll talk about a few other important events of the plot, but I really want to call attention to a few things that don't take up a lot of space necessarily in the narrative, but I think they're very important and very interesting. So amongst all the other things that our anonymous author is doing here, and he is in many ways influenced by, like we've said, a certain neoclassical style. There's a very sort of trite, I think, and cliche like love triangle that develops here that I don't know how interesting we're really going to find that. And again, as Castillo-Falou points out in the intro, none of these events, nothing that happens in the story will really strike us as surprising since we already know how this turns out. So there's not a lot of suspense to be had in the plot, and a lot of these characters, although they are somewhat multidimensional, they still come off a little bit flat, perhaps a little less than interesting at times, but there are some really cool ethnographic details, some specific details about these pre-Columbian, pre-contact civilizations as they existed prior to the Europeans arriving. And again, this is just a version of history, or these are just historical details that we don't always get a lot, particularly in North America. So the author is very interested in aspects of the Tlaxcalan culture. So if you guys know what ethnography is, it kind of comes into play here. It's simply a branch of anthropology that concerns itself with other cultures. So we're learning a lot about this particular culture here, and I just find certain details really fascinating, and I wanted to point us to a few passages in the very early stages of the narrative. So over on page 8, we get some of these brief but interesting descriptions. And again, they don't take up a lot of space in the narrative, but we learn some interesting things about these people and about how they live and about sort of the composition of their society. And again, we're learning that they are sophisticated urban dwellers. And this might come as a little bit of a surprise to a lot of North American readers because we've often been sort of taught or handed this conception of Native Americans as often being sort of nomadic. They're often sort of depicted in our own sort of U.S. history as sort of being somewhat nomadic or sort of sparse in terms of numbers, maybe not always living necessarily in cities, not necessarily having large population centers, existing maybe in smaller bands, more spread out. And a lot of that is based on some fact. Many North American tribes did live that way. But when we move to Mesoamerica, which consists of Mexico and much of Central America, and also true in South America, we see different types of Native American civilizations, different types of cultures who live differently, and that influenced the sort of rise of a different kind of European empire. Not better or more benevolent than what we see in British America, just different. So some of these details that we see about the Tlaxcalans will kind of help us to understand these differences in these different parts of America. So again, we get these descriptive passages like on page 8 that I wanted us to take a look at. So if you look at the first 2 full paragraphs on page 8, you're getting some basic details about Tlaxcala, this republic, this sort of autonomous society that exists near the Aztec Empire, but is not necessarily a true part of it. They've kind of resisted the Aztec control. So I want to jump down to the second full paragraph on page 8. The castles, fortified towers, and palaces did not contrast with the huts inhabited by the poor, publicly and scandalously insulting their misery. Let's just take a moment to think about what the author is saying in that sentence. The castles and towers and palaces of Tlaxcala did not contrast with the huts of the poor. So what he's trying to do here, and what he does often throughout the narrative, is create this contrast between the Tlaxcalans and the Spanish. And he's showing how the Tlaxcalans are superior in many ways. So this is really kind of a stunning reversal of what we would typically see in a North American or a British American narrative of conquest and colonization. Just think about Ralston again. Just think about Reuben and Rachel. Here, our Native American characters are not inherently inferior to the Europeans. They are not portrayed as noble savages. They are something else entirely. And what the author is saying here in the first sentence of this paragraph is he's saying, unlike what you would find in Europe, in places like Spain, there is not such a huge difference between the haves and the have-nots. So again, there's an implied contrast or comparison being created here between the societies of Europe and the civilization that we're seeing here in Tlaxcala. Here we have a more equitable, a more fair society. So yes, they have nice things, they have nice buildings, but there's not such a contrast between the rich and the poor, not as sharp of a contrast as one would see in Europe. Okay, so kind of a subtle little comparison there in that sentence. Tlaxcala, the capital, a very heavily populated city, was situated on 4 prominent hills, all not far one from the other, which extended from east to west. The rugged terrain served as a fortress for them. These 4 neighborhoods, or separated villages, communicated with one another by different streets with thick walls that served them as ramparts. So this is just interesting to me. Again, the author doesn't spend a lot of time on these details, but this is a very urban environment. And again, in North America, we don't often think about Native Americans as living in cities, even though there were large population centers in North America that early Spanish explorers came into contact with in the 16th century. And that early contact was probably at least part of the reason why those large population centers broke up and sort of splintered not long after. But again, in our sort of version of American history, we don't often think about Native American cities, Native American urban environments with buildings and streets and walls. Also important to point out that they're very connected to a sort of larger system of allies. Again, most of these people speak similar, the same language or variations of the same language. So they have ambassadors from other civilizations, other states, other cities come and visit them. We learn more on the next page. Page 9. Trying to find, so if you look at this, the second to last full paragraph on page 9, so a little bit later on, the ambassadors of Cortez awaited the resolution of the Congress. Again, they have this deliberative political body that makes most of the major decisions for the state. The ambassadors of Cortez awaited the Congress lodged in a public building named Calpisca and meant especially for that purpose. So again, this is a small thing, a minor detail, but it is kind of important, right? The Tlaxcalans have built a structure intended only to lodge ambassadors from other places that come to visit them on political or, errands to come and communicate with the Tlaxcalan Congress. So this is another brief but telling detail that indicates how advanced the Tlaxcalans are politically, and also it shows how connected they are. Again, they're not isolated. Even though they're not necessarily a part of this Aztec empire, they have allies. They have people they trade with. They have people that they have, treaties and alliances with. So they have an entire building just for foreign ambassadors, which is another sign of how advanced of a society they are. Moving on in that same paragraph, the following day, the Spanish ambassadors were summoned to the National Building, a different building, where the Congress celebrated its sessions. They were held in a large hall where individuals were seated according to seniority, much like the modern-day U.S. Senate. And they were seated on low stools made of exquisite woods carved out of one piece. These were called yopales. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm mispronouncing a lot of words as I talk about this book, no doubt. But again, just notice the details. The buildings, the stools, carved out of exquisite wood. We learn about some of the procedures of their Congress, right? Again, we don't get a ton of this, but they are interesting details about the Tlaxcalan sort of way of life that tell us a lot in a relatively condensed space. And we can learn a lot from these details. We also learn that they're sort of a warlike people. They're described at one point as bellicose, which means sort of aggressive, warlike. So they're kind of renowned for their prowess in battle. And of course, our hero, Hiko Tencatl, he is the young general of the army. So he is sort of a representation of this entire society, right? He is noble, he's virtuous, he's brave, certainly not afraid of a fight. So I think on page 8, the Tlaxcalan character, sort of writ large, is described as bellicose, long-suffering, frank, so they're very honest, little given to pomp, the enemy of effeminacy. So they're described as very tough, very independent, sort of self-sufficient. But later, we also hear that they are complete strangers to duplicity. They're very honest by nature. So this kind of puts them at a disadvantage when they're dealing with the Spanish, because of course the Spaniards lie to them and cheat them and deceive them in many different ways, and they're kind of a little bit susceptible to that because they haven't really encountered a lot of that in their part of the world. So just a few other things I wanted to mention about style before we kind of jump back into a few key characters and plot developments, just kind of going back to the style of our anonymous author. I've already mentioned the neoclassical influences. So, part of what's weird here, and it's part of what we have to navigate as readers, and again, it's kind of familiar by now, I hope, is that we have these older literary forms being used to describe things that are very unique to the Americas. So this author, yes, he's very interested in Native American culture in a way that, frankly, early U.S. authors simply were not to this extent. So that's noteworthy, and that's certainly worth exploring. But when it comes to the way he's telling the story, and when it comes to a lot of the thematic material, not just his word choice and sentence structure, but also the themes, the key ideas at work here, a lot of that is also influenced by Spanish culture and Spanish American culture. So in the intro, we hear about honor, this concept of honor, and what it meant in Spain during, this sort of, the era of conquest and the conquistadors, and what it would have meant a little bit later on in Spanish America, places like Cuba and Mexico, where our author probably originated. So We don't have to I'm not going to get into this in too much detail. It's in the intro. Read the intro. But there's this idea of honor as this really important concept, and it's not just based on the actions of an individual, usually a man. It's also based on the behaviors of all the women for whom that man is responsible. So that comes up in the book when we see this love triangle develop between our hero, young X, the Native American princess, Tutila, and then the one virtuous Spaniard that we meet, Ordaz. So even though nothing happens between, Ordaz is in love with her, and then later in the book, they are, Tutila and Ordaz are alone together, and young X, they're not doing anything illicit. But young X discovers them, he gets upset. Eventually it's all kind of resolved, but there are a lot of concerns about honor here. We see a little bit of it early on with Ordaz and some of his amorous adventures that you guys will read in the first few books involving Donna Marina. But this concept of honor shows up, and it seems to be, again, sort of an inheritance of an older Spanish tradition. But like Castillo-Falou says in the intro, there's the sense that maybe by the end of the book, we're almost kind of rejecting this old world, this European notion of honor, and we're kind of rejecting it as old-fashioned and out of date. Because a final thing to remember about neoclassicism, like I mentioned, it's kind of this revival of older forms, but if we're thinking about it in the English language tradition, and this is kind of true in Europe sort of in a larger sense, part of what the neoclassical era, historical era, helps to usher in is what we often think of as kind of the beginning of a more modern sort of culture or a more modern worldview, a more modern sensibility, as we kind of fully move away from some of the traditions of the Middle Ages and like Elizabethan era or like early modern period. We're sort of moving into what we today might recognize as a more modern sensibility around the middle of the 18th century and then spilling over into maybe the later part of the 1700s. So again, we can kind of understand that because of the things that are happening in the world at around that time. And one of the things that starts to happen towards the late 1700s and then into the early 1800s are all of these wars for independence, great technological advancement, change in a lot of different areas. So if we kind of think of neoclassicism as helping to usher in a more modern worldview along with more modern artistic forms like the novel, which are still with us today, then we can kind of see how that whole process is kind of playing out maybe a little bit here, as a lot of what the Spaniards brought with them to the Americas, a lot of what they were bringing was almost a medieval culture. Castillo-Falou says that this notion of honor that existed in Spain, maybe it came from the Visigoths, maybe it came from the Moors, but it came from a long, long time ago. And we have to remember, these conquistadors, they were kind of medieval. They were still kind of living, and they were from a medieval society, really, in Spain in the early 1500s. That wasn't quite a modern society by our definition of that term. So what we're seeing is that the more modern society, the society with a more modern sensibility, with a more modern government, would be the Tlaxcalans. They are, in many ways, more advanced. The Spaniards have superior technology. The Spaniards have the ability to make war a little bit more successfully because of better weaponry and the ability to, build ships. But in many other more sort of perhaps important ways for the author, the Tlaxcalans are more noble, they're more virtuous, and they're more advanced sort of socially, politically, and culturally. And I think the readers are meant to notice that. So again, the guy that kind of represents these classic Tlaxcalan values really is Hiko Tenscatl, our protagonist. And again, I don't know how interesting of a character he is. He's just kind of a typical hero. He's very brave, maybe even a little bit impetuous and reckless. He's young, but of course he's guided by virtue. And he's kind of a paragon of virtue, but he's very much representative of his people. And we're supposed to contrast him with Cortez. So you guys should be sort of examining those two characters in relationship to one another. So again, he's skeptical of the Spanish from the start. And initially, his father kind of agrees, in the initial course of action agreed upon by the Tlaxcalans is to not cooperate with the Spanish. Remember, the Spanish want to get to modern-day Mexico City to wage war on the Aztec Empire. And to do that, they really needed the assistance of a lot of these smaller vassal states, a lot of these traditional enemies, in some cases, of the Aztecs who wanted to see the Aztecs go down. So they aligned themselves with the Spanish. And in real life, the real historical events that are being portrayed here, the Tlaxcalans were one of the tribes that allied themselves with the Spanish against the Aztecs. And they actually gained a few concessions from the Spanish and were allowed, the Tlaxcalans, and were allowed a degree of autonomy that was not necessarily always typical in Spanish America. But we'll talk more about that next week when we cover the second half of the book. But so that's what's happening here, right? The Spanish are trying to kind of march on the seat of empire, but they need help. And the Tlaxcalans are like, we're not going to cooperate. We're not going to let them march through our territory. And in fact, the young X leads their army out in the field to fight the Spanish, and he really defeats Cortez and the Spanish forces initially. But at a very pivotal moment, we learn that he kind of stops the battle, or he stops pursuing the scrambled Spanish forces because he's suffered heavy losses. The Tlaxcalans have suffered heavy losses. I think in the book it's described as most of his corporals have been killed. I think corporal in this case is just a catch-all phrase meaning his officers. So he suffered major losses, and he kind of breaks off the battle to tend to his losses, which I think is presented to us as kind of a noble move. He's showing concern for his fellow countrymen. He wants to assist them, or at least maybe bury his dead. But that kind of allows the Spanish to regroup. But then later, the villainous Magiscatsin is able to sort of bribe or trick some of the other caciques, some of the other military commanders who are serving under Young X. They turn on Young X, and we almost have like a civil war. Tlaxcalans turning on Tlaxcalans, and there's this internal strife that ultimately makes them unable to defeat the Spanish. So the Senate eventually pursues peace and decides, okay, we're not going to be able to win, so we'll cooperate with the Spaniards, and hopefully they'll just sort of leave us alone. So by page, I think, 43, the Senate has decided to pursue peace. But again, this has happened because of the treachery and the betrayal of Magiscatsin, who has entered into these sort of secret dealings with Cortez. And he's actually working against his people's common interest, and he hates Young X and opposes him for for various reasons. So that's all happening, and then about 10 pages later, on page 52, the Spanish actually enter Tlaxcala, the capital of the state, or the society, the civilization. They enter, they occupy it, and then we have a very interesting scene, or sort of an exchange, that I wanted to call attention to on pages 45 and 46. We have some interaction between our hero, Young X, and Cortez. So if you guys turn to 45, this is, I think, the first time they meet. This is when the Tlaxcalans are kind of surrendering, or just sort of calling for a truce. And they send Young X as their military leader to kind of deliver that message to Cortez. And initially, Cortez receives him with a lot of sort of pomp and circumstance and kindness at the bottom of page 45. But then when the two of them are alone together, Cortez's manner changes. So you can see their conversation continue over at the top of page 46. But again, we're supposed to see the contrast between these two characters. And a few other characters that I want you guys to just kind of think about and maybe jot down some notes on. I've already mentioned Magiscatson. He is a villain, right? The treacherous senator who works for Cortez. But just the fact that he exists kind of reminds us yet again that our author, whether it's Father Varela or somebody else, our author is really presenting fully formed characters in ways that we wouldn't expect to see in other accounts of conquest and colonization and the New World. Again, other portraits of Native Americans would not have allowed for a large range of personality types. That's something you notice if you read a lot of Native American themed literature from the 19th century in the U.S. Even authors who are kind of trying to favorably portray Native Americans, kind of like Rowson a little bit in Volume 1, not Volume 2, in Volume 1 of Reuben and Rachel, or even like Freneau, if you remember some of the Freneau poetry that we read at the very beginning of the semester. Even when they're trying to portray Native Americans in a more favorable light, they fall back on stereotypes. They fall back on the sort of noble savage idea that, yeah, maybe the natives sort of had a native nobility and dignity, but, you know, they didn't possess the sophistication or the technology or the advanced kind of societies that they needed to be able to withstand invasion. Again, we're getting a completely different portrait here. These are advanced societies. They're urban. They're huge population centers. We have major cities with impressive buildings, deliberative bodies, advanced governments, advanced militaries. So we're not falling back on those same stereotypes. And even though most of the Native American characters are presented as virtuous and noble, most Tlaxcalans are, there are exceptions. Because all people, all groups of people have a wide range of different personality types. Not all people are good. So this is actually a sign of a certain degree of complexity that actually, again, is kind of part of the larger project here, the historical accuracy that I think the author is striving for. Because, yeah, this was a complex network of alliances and conflicts. Again, this socio-political environment in central Mexico in the early 16th century is very complex. And I don't think the author really always paints it quite as clearly as maybe we would like. But we do get this sense that it's very complex. There are all these different groups, all of these different cultures and identities, and there's a lot of allegiances, there's a lot of tension and long-standing rivalries. And again, the Spanish exploited that as they were conquering the Aztec Empire. So within such a complex society, you're going to have a wide range of different kinds of people. So Magisgatson kind of represents the complexity and the humanness, the real humanness, if that makes sense, that we're seeing here with our Native American characters. Also, think a little bit more about Ordaz, our one virtuous, noble Spaniard who falls in love with Totila. So Totila is a familiar character to us. She is the Native American princess, kind of a character type. We also saw that type show up in Reuben and Rachel, but she has a little bit more agency than some of these other characters that we've seen of that similar type. She has more to say. I would argue that she might have a little bit more to do. And remember, she is the daughter of the former ruler of Zocatlan, another sort of state, a smaller state or society that is a vassal state of the Aztecs. They are not traditional allies of the Tlaxcalans, but they sort of want to be, according to her. They are sick of paying this really exorbitant tribute to the Aztecs, and they want to get out from under the thumb of Aztec rule. So again, this is yet another society, another state, another group, or another tribe, another civilization that again has a lot in common maybe with some of these others, but they are culturally distinct. But she's fallen in love with young X, but Ordaz falls in love with her. So we have that interesting love triangle that we can talk more about next week. Also, his buddy, the priest, Olmedo, the only other Spaniard who's sort of shown to be decent, but he's more of a conformist versus Ordaz. We know Ordaz is good because he's skeptical of Cortez, and he's really skeptical of the entire Spanish mission in the New World. He's sort of like, we're supposed to be here representing King and our king and the church, but we really just seem to be here for money, for material gain, and conquest. So he's skeptical of the whole mission. His friend, the priest, really isn't in the same way, at least not early on. The priest is more sort of, trusting. He's more loyal to the crown and to Cortez. But he is not shown to be malicious like so many of the other Spaniards. And of course, Cortez is not a very, the leader of the Spaniards is not depicted as being very three-dimensional or complex. He's kind of monstrous. So the portrayal of Columbus that maybe we wanted to see, the more accurate portrait that we wanted to see in Reuben and Rachel, maybe we're seeing something like that now in Cortez. He's really depicted as a villain, a liar, brutal, violent, sort of unfeeling. So let's track his character. Let's see if there's any development, any growth. Is there any three-dimensional qualities to him? Or is he sort of a cardboard cutout villain who's serving a very specific role in the plot, but maybe isn't the most interesting character? We'll think more about him. And also Donna Marina, who's a Native American woman who is given to Cortez as a slave by one of the early tribes that the Spanish conquer, upon their first arrival on Mexican shores. So she's given to Cortez as a slave, but later becomes his concubine and confidant. So like we hear in the intro, she's a complex character as well. She kind of starts out a bit like a villain. She becomes sort of infatuated with Ordaz, and they have a little bit of a fling early on, and I think that's book 2 maybe. But then her character does kind of develop, perhaps in some interesting ways. So we can think more about her. She occupies a very interesting position, if nothing else, because she kind of has this important role because Cortez kind of trusts her, and she's entered into a sexual relationship with him, which causes problems, but she's very much torn between two cultures, the Spanish and the Native American cultures of this particular region. Her own, again, she belongs to kind of her own group, but even just thinking about sort of the larger, this larger central Mexico sort of region, and this very complex socio-political world that we're in here. So this author does engage in some interesting world building, to use kind of a modern phrase. This is a world that I don't think a lot of American students, I can certainly speak for myself, the first time I read the book, I was not very familiar with this world and all of its complexities. So just the final thing I wanted to mention very quickly before I sign off here is this sort of larger idea that's been discussed for a long time by historians. And we don't need to get too deeply into it because we're not historians. I'm certainly not. But I just want to throw this out there and just kind of put it in your minds, because this is another reason why this book matters and why it's sort of been rediscovered, or maybe really discovered for the first time by a lot of English language American lit scholars, North American or U.S. lit scholars to be more specific and accurate, is because it gives us an alternative history that we need, and it gives us a perspective that we're often lacking. So there's this idea that's been, really, I think, largely confirmed by now, which is that Mesoamerica, again, Mexico and most of what we now think of as Central America, along with the Inca Empire and the Andes, largely in Peru and South America, those were the two original sort of centers of the Americas. Those were sort of the original sources of power for the Spanish American Empire. So there's this idea that the original center of America was not British North America, but rather Mesoamerica, largely where we are here in the book. And this is really borne out by the history. So we see the huge population centers that existed in, where we are here in central Mexico, and also, like I said, the Incas in Peru. And after the Spanish conquered those two areas, the Spanish Empire really took off much earlier than the British Empire took off in the future U.S. So again, this is pretty, I guess, obvious, but we just don't think or talk about it very much. Again, our version of colonial history is usually centered on British North America, but Spanish America got started sooner. So again, we're in the early 1500s here, as the Spanish Empire really takes off. The British Empire in North America really wouldn't take hold until late 1600s, when there was really a good solid foothold, and the British didn't kick out the French and sort of consolidate control over the future US until like the 1760s, not long before the American Revolution started. So British America was shorter in duration and smaller in scope than Spanish America. And that's a reality that, frankly, a lot of U.S. people just don't know or maybe don't want to acknowledge. But it's true. So throughout the 16th century, throughout the 17th century, and even in the early 18th century, up until about the midway point of the 1700s, right around the time the neoclassical period was ending, that's the point at which British America finally kind of surpasses Spanish America in terms of economic power, in terms of sort of political power, in terms of sort of advancements and sort of potential for future growth. But prior to that shift, for really the 200 years or so prior to the middle of the 1700s, Spanish America had bigger populations, larger scale agriculture, and really more advanced societies. And a big reason for that is because of central Mexico and Peru. Those were huge Native American population centers. So even after they were conquered, they provided, unfortunately, very large free labor forces. They also had mastery of a lot of agricultural techniques that the Spanish were able to basically just appropriate and use for themselves. And the Spanish began to intermarry increasingly with Native Americans, which essentially created a new race or ethnicity that had not really previously existed in the world, that came to be known as mestizos. And that did not happen at the same rate or on the same scale in British North America. Of course, there was some intermarriage, but not on the same scale. So again, British America just took longer to get going, and it was more spread out, and it didn't have those major population centers that Spanish America had. The Native American populations were more spread out and were a little more sparse in North America. So again, these are just interesting historical facts that this book is kind of reminding us of or calling our attention to. We're seeing the early days of the Spanish Empire, and we're realizing that some of these civilizations and societies that the Spanish came across were very advanced, very complex, and because of that, Spanish America kind of had this early built-in advantage when it came to economics, population, and really just potential. But of course, who got to enjoy the fruits of that labor? Not the Tlaxcalans, not necessarily the characters that we spend most of our time with here in this story. So again, we're getting the same old story of conquest, but we're getting it more from the Native American perspective here, which is worthwhile, and it gives us a lot of new, I think, food for thought. But just think of this a little bit as a hemispheric history. Again, a little bit like what we saw early on in Reuben and Rachel. We're thinking about the history of the Americas in a sense that goes beyond just the U.S. And if we can kind of get past the neoclassical style and the sort of contrived love story that plays out here, and if we can really kind of zero in on the ethnographic details about the Tlaxcalans and sort of what we're seeing here in terms of this historical narrative, I think that is mostly where the value lies in this book. So again, a hemispheric sense of American history. Yes, there are a lot of differences between British and Spanish America, but let's also think about the commonalities. Let's think about the connections between the Caribbean, South America, Mexico, the U.S., and maybe even Canada. All at one time, they were all colonies. Spanish down south, British more in the north, but what binds them all together? We've already mentioned a few things: slavery, colonization, and being sort of torn between different identities. And that plays out in the book as well. In some ways, Hiko Tinkatl is sort of supposed to be a symbol, the guy, the character. He's supposed to be sort of a symbol of the modern Mexican citizen of the 1820s, oppressed by the Spanish as Mexico was finally emerging from Spanish rule in the 1820s, still kind of, torn between Spanish oppression and some kind of new identity, or maybe an older native identity. But it's complex, it's fraught. And remember, the 1820s were a time of great change, but what this author wants us to see are connections between what's happening in the 1820s as Latin American countries are fighting for independence. What's happening in the 1820s is connected to what was happening almost exactly 300 years earlier, around the 1520s, and the events that we're seeing in the book. So I'll come back, we'll cover the second half of the novel in week 10, and I'll see you then.